Welcome to episode 26 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about in this episode at www.7 spelt out, so SEVEN health.com/26.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm Chris Sandel. This week is another show where I interview a guest. But before I launch into that, I just want to mention that I'm in the process of taking on new clients at the moment. I do this twice a year, once at the start and once in the midpoint, and now's one of those times where I'm taking on clients. I work with clients for a period of 5 months. We have a consult every 2 weeks and it's for an hour. I have clients who are based all over the world, so you don't have to be based in the UK to work with me. A lot of my clients are in Australia and Canada and Germany and the US and other places around Europe and the world. If working with me appeals to you, then what I normally do with people is I start off by having a free initial chat. And this allows me to find out what's going on with you and what you're wanting help with. And it gives me an opportunity to explain how I work with clients and how that process works. So basically this free initial chat, it's obligation free. It's a way for us to find out if we're the right fit for one another. Because really I only want to work with people that I truly believe I can help, but are also on the same page with me in terms of my kind of ideas and approach. So this chat allows that to happen. So if you're interested in finding out more, you can head over to www.7 spelt out, SEVEN health.com/help. And there'll be more details there. On that page, you'll see a button where you can apply to have a free chat. And I will then respond to that within 24 hours, normally much quicker than that. And we can then arrange a time that works for both of us. So if you want to start 2016 with some help with your health or your eating or nutrition, body image, food issues, anything along those lines, then head over to www.seven-health.com/help. So with that now out of the way, let me tell you about today's show. Today's show is an interview I've done with Stephan Guyenet. And Stephan is an obesity researcher and neurobiologist who brings together cutting-edge biomedical research with an evolutionary health framework. His research spans neurodegenerative diseases, aging, nutrition, and obesity, but in more recent years has been focused primarily on the neurobiology of eating behavior and obesity. And he's received a BS in biochemistry from the University of Virginia and a PhD in neurobiology from the University of Washington. And his upcoming book, The Hungry Brain, will explain the neurobiology of why we often overeat despite our best intentions. So I've been following Stephan for about 4 or 5 years now. I can't remember exactly when it was, but I think I found his stuff or was exposed to him through Matt Stone. Matt Stone had linked to some of his articles. And in the show, we cover food palatability and how this can relate to overeating. We look at the weight set point theory and what this is all about. We chat about sugar and is it the villain it's made out to be, and a whole lot more. So I really enjoyed this chat and I hope that you do too. Hey Stephan, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Good to be with you, Chris.
So let me just start off by saying that I'm a real big advocate of your work. I think I've been following you for the last 3 or 4 years, and you're an obesity researcher, but you're very well researched. And I know for a lot of people, when they think about obesity researchers, a lot of it is just eat less, move more, but your blog shows that there's much more that goes into it than this. And I like the fact that you often bust a lot of myths, and this is stuff that I want to cover on today's show. But yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying how much I value your content and your site.
Thank you.
So to start with then, why don't you just explain a bit about your background and how you got into obesity research?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've always had an interest in science, even as a little kid. I was always trying to learn something about science, doing little experiments in my backyard and things like that.
Sure.
And that affinity for science has continued for my entire life. And I got a BS in biochemistry in college with the idea that I would apply that to understanding neuroscience, which to me is, one of the greatest remaining frontiers in the biomedical science, and in science in general. And it's something that we still have a lot to learn about. So I was fascinated by the brain, also because, the brain is what makes us who we are. The brain is what generates our behavior and our thoughts, etc. So I was really interested in studying the brain, and I went to graduate school at the University of Washington and studied primarily neurodegenerative disease. And I was studying a disease that is quite rare called SCA7. And I guess, it was interesting work, and it had some relevance to other more common diseases. But in the end, I kind of felt like I wanted to tackle something that was had a larger influence on people's lives, something that was a lot more common. And I think that you can hardly imagine something that impacts people's lives more than obesity. So I decided to do a postdoc I was offered a postdoc position by Mike Schwartz at the University of Washington, and I took my neuroscience background and applied it to obesity. And for those of you who are not accustomed to thinking about the connection between the brain and body fatness, it's actually a very strong connection. So the brain actually actively regulates body fatness and appetite and that sort of thing. So it's actually a very natural thing to be interested in, the brain is, if you're interested in obesity. And so anyway, while I was a postdoc, I felt that the things that I was learning about and the research I was doing was so interesting that I wanted to write about it, and I wanted to let people know about it, because a lot of it is fairly counterintuitive. We have this, this is kind of one of the things that's emerged from neuroscience over the last few decades, not just neuroscience, psychology also, is we have this idea that we're kind of in, conscious control of our brain processes and our behavior. But in fact, there's a lot that we do that's not really conscious at all or minimally conscious. And those non-conscious processes have very marked impacts on our behavior. And so, but it's counterintuitive, because people think, they feel like they know why they did certain things.
Yeah.
And they feel like they're in control of their eating behavior. And so when I encountered all this evidence that said, well, actually, no, there's this very complex, completely non-conscious system that's regulating your appetite and eating behavior, that's very counterintuitive, is contrary to people's, perceptions. And so to me, it was very interesting. And I think it's also interesting to other people because it explains a lot about our eating behavior, about how we eat and how we, become fat or don't become fat. So anyway, I developed that blog, and my postdoc ended a couple years ago, and since then I've been writing a book.
Okay. And how many obesity researchers approach it from that neuroscience and brain way of thinking about things?
Well, obesity research is a huge discipline. So there are a lot of different facets of research that are happening. Some of them have to do with the brain. A lot of them don't have to do with the brain. But I think it's nevertheless pretty well accepted in my field that the brain is the organ that principally regulates food intake and body fatness. And I think, honestly, it's hard to imagine it any other way. The brain is the organ that, it's the information processing organ of the body. It's the thing that collects information from inside and outside your body and generates all of your behaviors, including your eating behavior. So, how could it not play an important role in this process?
And so if we're then looking at maybe the last 100 years, or probably more like the last 30 years, because I think it's really been since the 1980s that obesity has started to really skyrocket. What has changed in your opinion, and what are the important things that have changed in diet and lifestyle that have led to this?
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's also a difficult one to address because it's basically a series of uncontrolled observations.
Yeah.
But I think first of all we can take a step back, and if we go back to the 1890s in the United States, obesity levels were actually a lot lower than they were even in 1980 or 1970. So there has been a slow, gradual progression toward higher obesity rates even before the quote-unquote obesity epidemic struck around 1978, 1980.
Yeah.
But as you said, there was this kind of like really fast, marked increase in obesity rates, really quite alarming, that happened over the course of it's still happening, but it happened at its maximum rate over the course of 20 or 25 years. And basically, I think in the broadest sense, we can attribute that to slow and gradual but profound changes in the way that we interact with food in this country. So, and not just this country, I mean globally, but I think the United States is in many ways kind of the canary in the coal mine. So basically what you have is a shift toward the outsourcing of food preparation in this country. So if you look back in the 1970s, most of the food that we ate was prepared in the home, in the kitchen, whereas today most of the food that we eat is either we're eating at a restaurant or we're buying pre-prepared food in the store. I mean, I just saw a paper by Barry Popkin and his colleagues suggesting that some like 70% of food that's eaten in the United States is pre-prepared, highly processed food. I mean, that is an extreme departure from historical norms. So we have this food system where we've outsourced food preparation to professionals, the food industry, the restaurant industry, that are competing vigorously for our quote unquote stomach share and our dollars. And the fact is they are really, really, really good at their jobs. They make these foods that are very, very compelling, tend to be very calorie dense because those are the foods that compete most favorably on, an open market. And not only do they create these very compelling foods, but they use every tool at their disposal to try to get us to purchase them. And so that includes making them extremely convenient, such as, fast food, drive-thrus, etc. Foods that you can pick up in the grocery store that are already ready. You just eat them or pop them in the oven or microwave. There's food in the checkout line of, the hardware store, of all kinds of stores that didn't used to have much food in them. Now it's like under your nose at all times. But not only that, they're giving us food cues practically at all times of day. So you see food ads on television. I think the average U.S. adult sees 20 food ads per day on television, and child sees about 12. You see them on your computer. You see them on billboards. Those are cues that remind you of the idea and the possibility of eating appealing foods. So that basically says to your brain, hey, you could get a hamburger right now, or you could get fries or whatever. And you might not have had any desire to do that a moment ago, but now you do. Or now if you walk into the store and you see two options, you're going to pick the one that you just saw on the billboard. People tend to be unaware that they are influenced by that sort of thing. In fact, people will say that they are not influenced by that sort of thing, but if you actually measure it, they are influenced. It's just something that's happening on a less than conscious level. So I would say to sum it up, I mean, and I'm just talking about food. There's more than food that's happened, but I think that food is a predominant driver. You have a profound shift in how we interact with food in this country, and that has caused us to eat more calories. If you look at our calorie intake, it's gone up by, depending on the estimate, anywhere between 150 to, I think, up to like 500 calories a day. And that increase is single-handedly sufficient to explain the U.S. obesity epidemic. And I think the changes in food quality, in food appeal, in food availability, convenience are more than sufficient to explain that increase in calorie intake.
And is it, I mean, with that type of food, because I think if you went back to someone in the 1950s or 1960s, they would have said that they were eating their meals to a level of fullness. They weren't stopping at 80% full or anything like that. So is it that this food then is so palatable that it overrides our hunger signals and our fullness signals? Is that like part of it as well?
I think that is part of it. If you look at, I mean, it's difficult to compare directly between the palatability level of today's food and the food in the 1950s. But if you look historically, what you see is a trend that's been happening for thousands of years, that humans have essentially identified the quote unquote active ingredients that are rewarding / palatable in food. And we have increasingly purified those and combined them with each other to create foods that are more and more irresistible. So I think a great example of this is glutamate, that chemical that creates the umami flavor, that kind of like savory umami flavor in bone broth and stuff like that. Bone broth is probably, bone broth predates written history. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors were probably eating that tens of thousands of years ago. And modern-day hunter-gatherers still make bone broth. And it's also found in cooked meats. So we've probably been eating it for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And we have a natural affinity for that flavor, probably because it's associated with meat. But if you look back about 2,000 years ago, people started finding increasingly effective ways of concentrating it. So then we had soy sauce, we had fish sauce, and things like that emerging that were much higher in glutamate. And this process culminated with the identification and isolation of the chemical active ingredient in umami, which is glutamate. In, I think, 1908 in Japan, a researcher isolated it, and that's where monosodium glutamate comes from. And so basically now this is, a crystalline, pure chemical that we can add to any food to increase the level of glutamate. And we've done that with many other things, like sugar is a crystalline, purified reward palatability factor that, is relatively recent historically that we have white sugar, or at least that it's easy to get. Salt is another purified, crystalline reward palatability factor that was not widely available until relatively recently in history. I know some cultures had salt, like the Romans and stuff, but if you go, prior to agricultural large-scale civilizations, most cultures did not have crystalline salt. And again, we have a taste for salt because it was good for our ancestors. Many of the environments we lived in there wasn't a lot of salt available in food. Sodium chloride is an essential nutrient for the human body, but obviously the amounts we eat today are, far surpass what we need. That's just because we still have that inborn taste, but we don't stop at, we don't stop just when we've had enough. We keep wanting more and more. And it's the same for all these things. We're not wired to say, oh, well, that's enough. We're wired to say, let me get as much of that as possible. So basically, we have gradually over the course of history purified these quote unquote active ingredients that our brains are looking for in food and combined them into more and more compelling foods. So that process did not stop between 1950 and today. And the food industry has worked tirelessly to use research and focus groups and even brain scans to try to figure out what is the ideal combination of ingredients to make you crave their food as much as is humanly possible. So I think, again, I don't have any direct comparison of palatability that I can say, like, researchers measured it in 1950 and they measured it today.
I get that.
But I think that it's pretty, if you look at the broad historical trends and the recent historical trends in how we, create and prepare food, I think it's pretty clear that has happened.
And I would also add to that, it's the variety as well. Because you can have something that's highly palatable, but if you're eating the same thing day in and day out, it loses that novelty factor. Whereas if you've got all these different palatable foods that you can then chop and change every single meal, that then means that you don't ever really get used to it or tired or bored of it. And so that, again, would increase the amount that someone's going to be able to eat. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's another kind of related point. And yeah, some people call that the buffet effect. I mean, we tend to overeat spectacularly at buffets. And it's because, for exactly what you said, we have this thing called sensory specific satiety, where we kind of get tired of or satiated with specific foods with specific sensory properties. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to keep eating something else. And so the more different things they are, if you take a bite of something different every bite, you're going to eat a lot more than if you're eating the same thing for your entire meal. And you won't even necessarily feel any more full on one than the other.
And so I remember reading, I think it was on your blog, was the first place I ever found out about it, was the idea of the weight set point theory. For someone who's never heard this concept before, what is the weight set point theory?
Yeah, so this ties back into the idea that the brain regulates body fatness on a non-conscious level. So we have a lot of things in our brain that are going on non-consciously, like you're not really consciously regulating your heart rate, you're not consciously regulating peristalsis in your digestive system. Like, there's so many things that are happening, even cognitive processes that are not conscious in your brain. Most of what's happening in your brain is not conscious. So one of the things that the brain is doing that you're not consciously aware of is it's regulating a number of processes in the body and trying to keep them in balance, trying to keep them around a kind of optimal set value. And this is a process called homeostasis. And it's exactly the same way that your home thermostat works. So the thermostat measures temperature, and then it controls heat and cold to try to maintain the temperature that it's measuring within a certain range. And that's called a negative feedback system. So the brain does this for your body temperature as well. So the brain measures your temperature in a couple different places, and then depending on whether it thinks you're too cold or too hot, it enacts a variety of different physiological and behavioral responses, such as, blood vessel dilation or constriction in your skin, sweating, brown fat thermogenesis. It makes you feel cold, so you want to put on a sweater or turn up the heat or whatever. And between all those things, it's an extremely effective strategy. The brain manages to maintain your body temperature within about a degree Fahrenheit. So the brain can be really good at controlling things like that. And one of the things that it controls is your body fatness. So it measures the amount of fat in your body using a hormone called leptin, just like your thermostat would measure temperature. And then it uses that information to control your food intake and your energy expenditure to try to keep those levels of body fat in a kind of optimal range. So obviously, and we have a lot of evidence that this is kind of what's going on. But I mean, obviously, it's not quite that simple, because we know that people can gain weight. We know that people can go from lean to obese, and we know that sometimes people can lose weight as well. So it's not a very rigid control system. However, what we do know is that it will defend your current weight against rapid changes, whether you're lean or obese. So lean and obese people, both and everything in between, your brain is actively trying to keep you at the weight where you are. And that's why weight loss is so difficult, because whether you're lean or obese, when you lose weight, your brain gets wind of it that your body fat levels are declining, and it kicks in a starvation response. It makes you hungrier. It makes you more interested in food. It makes you burn fewer calories in physical activity, makes you less likely to engage in physical activity, and let's see, I'm missing something here. Whatever, I left something out, but
sure.
Anyway, basically it is trying to increase your calorie intake and reduce your calorie expenditure and bring the fat back. And the fact is, it works really well. You look at weight loss studies, it's hard to lose weight, and people often regain it in the long run. And we know that a lot of that relates to this homeostasis by the brain. It relates to the brain fighting back against the weight loss and trying to bring that fat back. So that's the basic idea of how the system works.
And in terms of there's two things I want to ask you about this. Is it likely that eating more processed food and eating more quote unquote junk food or highly palatable food starts to push that weight set point up? And then the other part of it is it also true that through the process of dieting, so someone actively restricting and maybe losing some weight, that over time the body also starts to increase that weight set point? Are either of those true?
It starts to increase or decrease it?
So the more that someone diets, the more that their weight set point starts to increase.
Okay, so I'll take those one by one. And if I forget to answer the second one, bring me back to it.
Cool.
So yes, there is evidence that the set point is flexible. So the brain is kind of like the CPU of our survival machine, right? The brain is trying to, in an evolutionary sense, it's trying to help you stay alive and reproduce in whatever environment you're in. And it takes a lot of things into consideration in trying to manage that. So the set point, the idea, and this body fat regulation idea, is not quite as simple as you would design it if you were an engineer just trying to make something really, really stable.
Sure.
So there are a lot of different inputs coming in that are affecting the system is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
And we know from a lot of animal research and some human research as well that when you eat highly processed, highly palatable foods, when you eat a large variety of so-called junk foods, it increases the set point. So it's not just that you're eating more passively. Like, your brain wants that stuff so bad that it will actually increase your set point to allow you to eat even more of it. And we don't know all the details about exactly why that happens, but I think that it at least involves the reward value and palatability of the food. There's some fairly compelling experimental evidence that when you increase the palatability and reward value of the diet, the set point goes up, weight goes up. When you decrease the palatability and reward value of the diet, set point goes down, body weight goes down. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. I mean, because basically, what does it mean that a food is highly rewarding or highly palatable. That means that the brain intuitively places a very high value on that food. That's a food that the brain really wants you to eat based on, its own instinctive preferences. So when you encounter a food like that, the brain starts to pull out all the stops to you consuming that food. So it takes more at a meal for you to reach a feeling of fullness, the more palatable that food is. And there's evidence, I'm not saying that this is ironclad, but
Sure.
There's a fair amount of evidence that, as I said, the brain increases the set point in response to certain foods. So it's basically facilitating the consumption of foods that it perceives as exceptionally valuable to you.
Okay. And so then the second part is in regards to what happens to the weight set point in reaction to dieting. Because what I've seen or read or believe is that through dieting, it can also ratchet the weight set point up. And the explanation being given is that the body's trying to protect itself from a further famine, so it wants to hold things a little higher. Is that true or backed up by research?
Well, I'm not aware of evidence that the set point goes up in response to dieting, but there is a lot of evidence that it doesn't change in response to dieting, which means that if my set point is at 200 pounds and I lose 20 pounds, my set point's still at 200 pounds. So my brain thinks I'm starving until I go back up to the 200 pounds. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the set point would go up to 210, and then I would have to go back up to 210 to feel like I'm not starving.
Okay, fine. Cool. Because I have heard that before, and that's a mechanism. So if you're saying that's not backed up by research, then that's fine, I guess. Often,
so is this kind of the idea that weight cycling keeps increasing your set point?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that hypothesis. There's really not a lot of compelling evidence that supports it. I know there's, people who feel that has happened to them, and it's possible that it's happened to individuals, but there's really not a lot of research evidence to support it. One of my colleagues took rodents and weight cycled them a bunch of times, and basically it didn't really matter how many times they weight cycled them. It didn't really change their set point.
Okay.
And there's not really a lot of evidence in humans that occurs either.
Cool. The time when I guess it might start to happen is because of the dieting, someone is then reacting and then eating highly palatable food as part of a binge or part of their then recovery or off the wagon or whatever you describe it as. And so that process could, in theory, push the weight set point up as part of the recovery.
Maybe. Yeah, so that kind of like binging behavior, when you're dieting, your brain wants you to binge. Your brain is sending you signals, that you should be pigging out on chips or whatever. And that's part of the reason why it's so hard to do it and to maintain it. I see what you're saying. All I'm saying is that I'm not aware of any evidence that actually pushes up the set point.
Okay, cool. One of the things I would definitely want to chat about is sugar. And I know sugar is now blamed for a lot of the obesity epidemic, and sugar is villain number one at the moment. I think last year there was the Fed Up documentary and Gary Taubes and lots of people talking about this stuff. And I know that, I don't know if it was on your blog or on someone else's blog, talking about the fact that in the last 10 or so years that sugar consumption in the US has gone down. There's also the Australian paradox, which is the fact that since the 1980s, sugar consumption in Australia has been going down despite the fact that obesity is going up there. So what are your thoughts about sugar and obesity and how all of that impacts?
Yeah, so I think we have a fascination with simple single factor explanations for things.
I would agree with you 100% on that.
We like things that are simple and clear and, appear coherent. And we did the same thing with dietary fat back in the 90s. We thought dietary fat was the big cause of everything. Well, it turns out that neither dietary fat nor sugar are the big cause of everything, including obesity. And in fact, the evidence indicting dietary fat remains stronger than the evidence indicting sugar. But I think that most of them are, I think that both of them are part of the truth, is what it is that, dietary fat is not necessarily fattening, but if you eat it, if you're using it to increase the calorie density and the palatability of your food, then yes, it can be fattening. And the same thing is true of sugar. I mean, if you eat sugar as part of whole fruit that has a low calorie density, has lots of fiber, there is zero evidence that that is in any way fattening. And in fact, there's some evidence that it's slimming and improves blood sugar control rather than degrading it. But at the same time, you can take the same substance that's found in fruit, sugar, and you can concentrate it and make it into candy and soda and all that stuff, and then suddenly it's fattening. So, and it is fattening, but it's only one part of the picture. And that's the thing that I was really trying to illustrate with that graph that I published. To my knowledge, I was the first one to point out that in the United States, refined sugar consumption has dropped pretty significantly over the last 15 years.
Is it something like 20%, if I remember correctly?
I honestly don't recall the number off the top of my head, but it's something like that. Yeah. And basically what you see is that our obesity rate has continued to climb as our sugar intake is going down. And our overall carbohydrate intake has gone down as well to a lesser extent. So, I mean, I put that graph up, and, it got a lot of attention, but I think the point of it is not that sugar is irrelevant. The point of it is that sugar is not the sole explanation for the predicament that we are in. And I think that really is the only reasonable explanation for the evidence. And there are a lot. I mean, you hear these claims like sugar is more fattening than other types of calories, and it does this and that. These hypotheses have been tested. We have extensive evidence from randomized controlled trials on the effects of sugar on body weight, on the effects of sugar on metabolism, energy expenditure, blood lipids, etc. There are tons of RCTs that have randomized controlled trials that have already been done. And so we know, I'm not saying our state of knowledge is perfect, not saying that, maybe these studies could be done for longer periods of time or whatever, but we have a fair bit of evidence on this question. And the reality is, if you control calories, if calories are the same, sugar has no more fattening ability than any other calorie. That being said, if you give people calorie-dense, highly palatable sugars, like soda, for example, and you're adding that into a regular diet and not keeping calories constant, people will have a tendency to eat more total calories and they will gain fat. And that's true whether you're looking at soda, whether you're looking at, potato chips, like any kind of calorie-dense, highly palatable food. If you add it into a diet, increase the palatability and the variety of that diet, people are going to eat more and they're going to gain fat. So yes, sugar is fattening, but it's not uniquely fattening. It's just one of the things that we need to be paying attention to. And yeah, I support efforts to try to get people to eat less sugar and to drink less soda. I think that is great. I think it's wonderful. It's important. Like Mexico's soda tax has had a modest but significant effect on, statistically significant effect on soda consumption. I think that's great. And I think that if we don't start doing stuff like that, we're just going to keep having this enormous public health crisis. But I think that if we focus exclusively on sugar, we're doing ourselves a huge disservice because it obviously is not the only culprit.
And from my perspective, it seems so strange when I see all this information about sugar or carbohydrates, and people talking about the fact that we got it so wrong in the 1980s when we were blaming fat, and yet they're making the exact same mistakes, where it's this very one-sided, narrow idea that it's all because of this one thing, where it's never going to be that simple, and it's going to be about lots and lots of different details that need to be focused on.
I was just going to say, I wonder what the next thing is going to be. Like, what's going to be the next, what's going to be the next sole cause of obesity in 10 years? I'm just waiting for it.
Well, I mean, look, protein hasn't had a bad rap for a while, so maybe we'll jump on that bandwagon. But there always is. I mean, it's all, you go back and it's always so cyclical. Every 10 years, 15 years, they'll change their mind and there will be some other public health warning about this thing, and we'll feel so silly that we were demonizing sugar for all that time.
Yeah.
And I know you have written about low GI diets, and I know low GI diets are sort of touted as this amazing thing, and you've talked about how they're not really as great as they're cracked up to be. Do you want to chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just quickly define it. Glycemic index is basically the degree to which a carbohydrate-based food raises your blood sugar. That's the definition of it. And so the idea is that the glycemic index, there's a couple different ideas that relate to this. One of them is that if you have a carbohydrate that digests quickly and raises your blood sugar really high, then your blood sugar is going to crash. That's going to increase your insulin secretion to kind of control that surge of blood glucose. And that is true. You do observe higher glycemic index carbohydrate create higher insulin release to kind of cover that carbohydrate and constrain it. And then you see the glucose levels go down, and sometimes they'll dip a little bit below where you started before the meal. And so the idea is that this so-called hypoglycemia could cause us to feel hungry and eat more food. The problem is that it's not really hypoglycemia. So if you actually measure the degree to which glucose levels decrease following a high glycemic meal, it's nowhere near the levels that you have to bring glucose to provoke hunger in an experimental setting. So you don't see hunger, interest in food, and stuff like that at the levels of blood glucose that you observe after eating a high carbohydrate meal. And we often this idea of hypoglycemia is so ingrained in our psyche that we're constantly intuitively using it as an explanation for how we feel. And so people will say, hey, I'm feeling hungry. I think my blood sugar's low, or I'm feeling jittery. I'm in a bad mood. I'm hangry, and that's because my blood sugar's low. But if you actually measure someone's blood sugar, it's not low. It's normal. So we don't really know what causes those feelings. It's very, very rare that it's actually associated with true clinical hypoglycemia of the type that you might see in a person with diabetes who injected too much insulin or something like that. Because the body is really good at regulating blood glucose.
So if that's the case, is there any reason that someone should be looking at the GI of a food, whether it's low GI or high GI, when making a choice for their carbohydrates?
Well, let me just say, first of all, that if you feel that eating, low GI carbohydrates make you more full than high GI carbohydrates, I'm not going to tell you not to do that. But what I will point out is that, there are single meal studies. There's studies where they feed people a single meal of high versus low GI carbohydrates. And it's true that there are a number of studies that show that people tend to feel more full after the low GI carbohydrate. But when you look at long-term studies where they're looking at long-term hunger and weight loss, et cetera, on people who are put on either a high or a low glycemic index diet, it's completely ineffective at controlling weight or appetite in the long term. I mean, and the other thing is, in these studies, they often don't control for things besides the glycemic index. So, for example, if I'm comparing like white crackers to beans or something like that, yeah, you're going to feel more full after you eat beans. But was that because the carbohydrate digests more slowly, or is that because they have a lot more volume per calorie? They have a lot more fiber. It's like, and they have more protein. So the point is that these studies often don't control for a lot of other things. So if the concept of glycemic index is a way for you to kind of conceptualize, how do I eat more whole foods? How do I eat foods that are higher in fiber and lower in energy density and are less refined? Then sure, I mean, it can be a useful heuristic. But what I say is that the actual mechanism by which those foods make you feel more full and help you control your weight may not actually be the glycemic index. It may be other properties of those whole filling foods.
Sure. And I think that's the thing I try and get across to people when I'm talking about it is that, yes, there's high GI foods that people think about in terms of chocolate bars or processed foods. But if you're talking about something like a parsnip or a white potato or white rice or those types of foods which are going to be higher in GI, then it doesn't really matter so much if you're comparing that to some other whole food that's in a low GI category.
Right. And, if somebody came to me and they said, hey, every time I eat potatoes, I end up feeling starving 2 hours later and I eat a bunch, I would say, yeah, eat fewer potatoes. That makes sense. But, I mean, the reality is that most people don't say that. Most people find potatoes to be extremely satiating, despite the fact that they have a very high glycemic index. And, I mean, between some friends and I, we grew 800 pounds of potatoes this year in our garden. And we've been eating potatoes are probably my number one source of calories right now. And I don't know. I just don't. They fill me up. I don't feel hungry afterwards. I don't, whatever this supposed effect is that's supposed to be making me feel hungry, I don't notice it. And I certainly haven't gained any weight.
Yeah. And look, I think white potatoes have got just the worst PR, but are actually really good. And I feel the same way. They're probably the carbohydrate I eat the most of. I eat a ton of white potatoes, and again, my weight is also steady. And the same with you. I feel after I eat them, I'm nice and warm, and they keep me feeling satiated for a long time.
Yeah.
So there was some interesting research that I saw last year, and I don't know how much you know about this stuff anyway, but looking at beliefs and how that can affect someone's weight. And the research looked at the fact that if someone believed that they are overweight, regardless of whether they were or not, that over time they would tend to eat more and would actually gain weight. So is there any research that you've seen along these lines in terms of people's beliefs about body image and weight gain or weight loss?
No, honestly, that's outside my area of expertise. I really don't know much about that research.
Okay, fine. And another thing that I see fairly commonly, so clients will come to me and they've got lots of different symptoms. And so it might be that they're having troubles with their period, or they're having trouble sleeping, or there's poor energy or poor mood, or they can't concentrate, or a whole range of different symptoms. And some of the time those people will be overweight or they'll be obese. And so we'll work together for a period of 5 months, 6 months, and during that time, their symptoms will either disappear or get markedly better. But a lot of the time with these clients, they're not actually seeing any weight loss, or their weight might even go up a little bit. I mean, is that something that then surprises you? Would you expect to see, if their symptoms are improving, that their weight should go down?
Well, let me ask you this. Were those people who were currently or had previously been losing weight or attempting to lose weight?
These are people, I mean, most of the people who come to me in the situation I just described there they consider themselves seasoned dieters. So they've been dieting on and off for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Okay. Yeah. This makes perfect sense to me. I mean, basically, so this system in the brain. Okay, so let's take a step back. Can you please describe to me again? You said loss of period, and what were some of the other things that you commonly see?
Trouble sleeping is a common one. There'll often be fairly frequent urination. There'll often be quite cold body temperature, difficulty in terms of energy or lethargy. They're kind of the common ones.
Okay, yeah, this is classic. So basically, this system in the brain that regulates body fatness, the way it tries to get you back up to your former weight is by engaging a starvation response. And basically, so this system is measuring the energy status of your body and comparing it against its own internal ideal, which is that set point. And so when you lose weight and you maintain a lower weight, there are a lot of different things that the brain engages, a lot of different responses that it engages in response to that perception of low energy availability. And so one of those is that it shuts down your period. So this is basically the system that regulates your body fatness is very closely intertwined with the system that regulates reproduction. And this makes a lot of sense because if you don't have enough energy in your body, you don't want to be trying to make a baby. And so it shuts down your reproductive function and you lose your period. This is the same thing that you see in young women who exercise really, really intensely and will lose their period. Basically, they're too lean. They're burning too many calories, and their brain's like, no, we can't make a baby right now, so we're going to shut down menstruation.
But in these clients, at the point that I'm seeing them, they're not lean. They're as I said, like overweight or obese.
Yeah, I understand that, but the point is that they're below their set point because you said that they are seasoned dieters. So basically, their bodies think that they're starving because they're below their set point. They're lower than where their body wants them to be because they've been dieting.
Okay.
So whether you're lean or obese, your brain engages the same starvation response when you lose weight. So these people are below their set point, and many of the things that you describe are classic. Cold body temperature, the brain basically tries to restrict energy expenditure, so your thyroid hormone goes down, your sympathetic nervous system activity goes down, your resting energy expenditure goes down a little bit, but mostly your physical activity energy expenditure goes down. The brain makes you feel tired and lethargic because it doesn't want you burning a bunch of calories. It wants you to sit around and eat a bunch of food so you get the fat back. So it makes you feel sluggish and lethargic. That's all part of this response. And the feeling of coldness, it shuts down your brown fat. It shuts down your thyroid hormone and sympathetic nervous system activity. I don't know about the poor sleep thing. I don't know how that relates to all this. But many of the things that you describe are absolutely classic symptoms of being below your set point. These are the responses that the hypothalamus engages to try to bring the fat back. And so presumably they're probably also pretty hungry as well. Is that something you've observed?
It depends on some of the people will be really hungry. Some of the time, hunger has been suppressed. But with some of the people who are at the heavier end, hunger will be suppressed for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, and then they'll suddenly be ravenous. It's like they don't have a hunger sensation unless it's at 10 out of 10.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I mean, I think that's still pretty consistent with the idea that they're having this overall response that's trying to bring the fat back. So basically what you've seen is that when you treat them with a whole food, home cooked diet, and I don't know all the details, but that's kind of what you explained to me, that you see the resolution of many of these symptoms that they're reporting. Is that right?
Yeah. So basically getting to a stage where they're basically symptom free, but they're still sitting at the high weight or even slightly higher than when we started. And when we then further try and look at, okay, let's pull your calories down, even in a fairly small way to try and lose weight, their symptoms start to come back.
Yeah, so I would say that their symptoms resolve most likely because you are bringing their set point in closer alignment with their current weight. And so there are a couple ways that could happen. One of them is, you mentioned, that sometimes they gain a little bit of weight. But the other one is that the diet strategies that you are recommending to these people may actually be lowering their set point, and that it may be aligning their set point with their current weight in that way. So just as I said that certain dietary factors can increase the set point, certain dietary factors can also lower the set point. And so in the same way that highly processed, highly palatable foods can increase your set point, eating simple whole foods can lower your set point. And there are other factors as well, but in general, eating those types of foods will lower your set point somewhat. It's not necessarily a dramatic effect, but it generally does have an effect. And so you find that people who start eating whole foods diets may feel more comfortable at a weight that they previously felt like they had to struggle to maintain. And I would theorize that that's what your clients are experiencing.
And do you think that there are people who've then been at a certain weight for so long in terms of their heaviness that realistically there's no way that they can get back down to being someone who is lean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we know that there are pretty substantial changes that occur in the brain that kind of try to lock in that higher weight. And yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess what I will say is that it is pretty rare for someone to go from a real obese state, like someone who is really fully obese, to someone who is really quite lean. That it's not that it never happens. You know, you see people on the internet. You see, what's that guy's name, Jared Fogle, and
yeah,
people like that. You know, there are exceptions, but those people are exceptions. It's pretty rare for people to go from really solidly obese to really solidly lean. And you know, there are people who are trying really hard at it and not getting there. And I think it's important to acknowledge and respect that really is a struggle for people. But that being said, I think that some amount of weight loss is usually possible, and getting to a point where you can feel good and be healthy is usually possible.
And do you, like, for that person who is being heavy all of their life, or for a number of years, they're at a stage where they just can't get it down any further, if they're then continuing to do the things that are healthy in terms of eating good home-cooked food, eating whole foods, doing regular exercise, etc., even if they're not seeing the shift in terms of their weight coming down, do you still believe that they're getting those improvements in their health?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at any given weight, you can be healthier or unhealthy, or you can be more or less healthy at any given weight. So there is definitely room for diet and physical activity, et cetera, to, you know, either cause, more modest weight loss, or to not cause weight loss at all, but still improve your, you know, how you feel and how you perform and your health risks. That being said, you know, I don't want to sugarcoat the truth, and that is that, you know, it's always going to be easier to maintain a state of health when you are leaner than when you're heavier. And I mean, let me get more specific about that so that my statement doesn't get misinterpreted. What I mean is that there are very strong associations between overweight and obesity and a variety of health problems. And those are causally related to having excess body fat. And so, yes, it is a health handicap to have excess body fat, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing you can do to reduce your risks.
Sure, but where does that health handicap really start on a BMI scale? Because from my experience, or from my understanding of things, is that a lot of the definitions of what we think to be healthy in terms of a weight is pretty narrow and is right down the lower end of the BMI, and we have these images of people with perfect abs and that kind of thing, which I think really skews people's beliefs about what a healthy weight should be. So where do you think it is that on the BMI that it starts to actually create a genuine problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an accurate observation. You don't have to have six-pack abs to be healthy by any means. And I think most people are probably not even capable of having a real six-pack abs. I mean, I think that takes a combination of genetics and working at it. But that being said, there are strong associations between body fat levels and metabolic disease risk. And there's basically no level of body fat that doesn't, fall on that spectrum. So like, the more fat you have, the higher your risk of diabetes is going to be. So that guy with the six-pack abs is going to have a very low risk of type 2 diabetes. And someone who has a little more fat but is still lean but doesn't have a six-pack, their risk is probably slightly higher, but it's still very, very low. So like, if you compare that to someone who is mildly overweight, they're going to have a much lower risk of diabetes, and the person who's mildly overweight in turn will have a much lower risk than someone who is obese. So even though there are associations that, as far as we know, apply to all levels of body fat, at least for certain things like diabetes, it's still not necessary to be a fitness model to be in a very low risk category, especially if your supporting diet and lifestyle are healthy. So I guess what I would say is that beyond a certain point, there's probably diminishing returns, but that point beyond which there's diminishing returns is not in the overweight range, it's in the lean range.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And so I know you mentioned at the beginning that you've got a book that you're writing called The Hungry Brain. So do you want to just explain a little about what it's going to be covering?
Yeah, sure. So the basic premise of the book is that, no one wants to overeat, no one wants to gain fat, and certainly no one wants to do it for, 10 or 20 years and become obese or overweight, develop diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc. Yet in the United States, at least, most of us do. More than two thirds of Americans are obese or overweight. So why do we do this thing that we clearly don't want to do? It suggests the fact that there are these non-conscious brain processes that are determining or at least strongly influencing our food intake behavior. So what are these processes? How do they work? And what are the signals, the cues that they're responding to from our environment and from inside our bodies that's causing us to increase our food intake? So I described one of these systems in this interview, which is the system in the hypothalamus that regulates your body fatness. That's one of those non-conscious systems that can make us eat more than we want and can cause us to maintain an obese state against our will. And there are several other of these systems. So basically, it's a brain-centered view on why we overeat.
Cool. And
it's let me just add that it's going to be targeted toward a general audience. So you don't have to be a researcher or a doctor or anything to understand it.
Sure. And when is it likely to come out? I know often it's hard to say or give answers because you don't really know, but yeah, when is it likely?
Yeah, we're shooting for September 2016. And as you said, that's uncertain. There's a lot of moving parts still. The manuscript is actually complete. I turned it into my publisher just a couple weeks ago. But there's a lot of other things that need to happen. They need to edit it. I'm still working on the illustrations. Oh, excuse me. I'm still working on the illustrations. I'm working with a really highly skilled medical illustrator based in Toronto. So it's going to be pretty cool.
Awesome. So look, we're nearly out of time, but for those who want to find out more about you, where should they be going?
Yeah, you can go to my blog, which is www.wholehealthsource.org. And I also have a Twitter handle, which is @WHSource.
Perfect. Well, look, thanks so much for coming on the show. As I said at the start, I really love following your blog and your work, and you've provided lots of really great information as part of this chat. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.